History is filled with diseases that wiped out generations off the face of the earth, and even then, not many stand out as unique as a plague for its impact and severity. Once known as the Great Mortality, it is credited for the deaths of millions of people around the globe. Let's take a look back at the deadliest plagues of all times. Number 10. The Plague of 1649. Seville, a Spanish city based in the Iberian Peninsula, witnessed a massive outbreak of the plague in 1647 when it perished a quarter of its population over 5 years. The plague erupted from the coastal city of Valencia, killing around 30,000 people there and ultimately making its way to Andalucía and then Seville. The city, wildly unprepared due to unenforced quarantine measures, lost 150,000 people and never really recovered from a devastation this intense. In total, Spain lost nearly 5% of its population, making the Plague of Seville the greatest plague in 17th century. Number 9. Moscow Plague. The Moscow Plague of 1771 was the last of major epidemics to demolish a European metropolis. It is credited to have caused the death of 100,000 Russians, which was an astonishing 1/3 population of the city. It was initially encountered by the Russia army, marching towards the city of Moldavia in late 1769. It reached the Dniester followed by Kiev, and by December first cases were reported in Moscow. At its height, it was killing over 1,000 inhabitants every day. In the wake of the panic among the masses, harsh quarantine measures were enforced, which directed the hate towards the medical authorities in particular. This resulted in a major breakdown of law and order situation. The military eventually managed to restore the order after a few days, but by then a huge amount of destruction had already occurred. Number 8. Plague of Athens. It erupted in 430 BC from sub-Saharan Africa until finally making its way to Athens through its port. It killed an estimated 300,000 people, including 1 in every 3 people in Athens. It is described as the most lethal epidemic in the classical Greece era and widely believed to have contributed to the decline and eventual fall of it. The Greek historian Thucydides described it as a rule, however, there was no ostensible cause, but people in good health were all of a sudden attacked by violent heats in the head, and redness and inflammation in the eyes, the inward parts, such as the throat or tongue, becoming bloody and emitting an unnatural and fetid breath. It spread like wildfire through numerous parts of Greece and Mediterranean until 426 BC, when it finally subsided. Number 7. Great Plague of London. 1665 observed the worst outbreak of the plague in England since 1348. 75,000 to 100,000 people lost their lives to the deadly disease, which was more than 1/5 of the entire population of London. First cases were reported in the spring of 1665, in a parish on the outskirts of the city. Death rate began to escalate in the summer and culminated in September, when around 7,000 deaths were reported in a single week. Between 1 and 3 people died in every infected home, and some extreme cases, whole families lost their lives to the disease. To prevent the disease from spreading further, authorities quarantined the affected in their homes. The end of autumn witnessed the alleviation of the disease, and those who fled were able to return to the city. Number 6. Great Plague of Marseille. Marseille, a wealthy and strategically important city on the coast of Mediterranean, had its history about plagues, due to which they had a strong sanitation board in place. On May 25, 1720, a ship arrived from Lebanon, carrying silk and cotton. Even though it was called at Cyprus, where there had been reports of plague, it was allowed into the port, which resulted in the eruption of the plague in the city within days. In no time, the city was overwhelmed by the sheer number of people losing their lives to it. Eventually, the city's infrastructure completely collapsed, leaving piles of dead on the streets. Parliament threatened anyone who tried to escape or even communicate with nearby towns with a death sentence. To further implement this, a heavily guarded wall was built around the city. Over 2 years, plague cost nearly 100,000 people their lives, including 50,000 in Marseille only, which made it the deadliest one the city would ever know. Number 5. Great Plague of Milan. Also described by some as the Italian Plague, it is considered as the last wave of the century-long epidemic of bubonic plague, and occurred from 1629 through 1631 in northern Italy. Historians believe it was French and German troops battling in 30 Years' War, who carried it to Mantua, infecting Venetian troops. In the next 2 years, it snaked its way across the country, devastating Venice, Verona, Florence and Milan. Despite harsh measures by the city council in their quest to control the disease, it still managed to eradicate 280,000 inhabitants, including half the population of Verona and 1/3 population of Venice. By 1631, approximately 60,000 people of Milan had succumbed to plague. Number 4. The third pandemic. It originated in the Yunnan province of China and is widely considered as the last Great Plague pandemic. Having erupted in the 1950s, it caused havoc on Chinese residents, decimating tens of thousands. It snaked its way to Hong Kong in the late 19th century, from where it traversed the globe through the major coastal hubs over the next decades. And when the 20th century began, the infected rats had carried it to all 6 inhabited continents through ships. Its eruption claimed lives of around 15 million people worldwide, including 12 million residents of India and China. But fortunately, it erupted in a time of scientific development, giving scientists a chance to test their germ theories and try to find a cure. Number 3. Antonine Plague. Rome was prospering under the rule of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus in 165 CE, when Verus's troops returning home from battling the Parthians brought along with them the plague as another souvenir from West Asia. Romans ruled the Mediterranean and their ships and armies swarmed across it. Well, so did the disease. The next 2 decades watched the Roman Empire engulfed in an outbreak unlike it had ever seen. The disease diminished after 180 CE but flared up again in 189 CE before finally dying down. At its peak, 2,000 people were dying every day. In total, plague cost 1/3 of the entire Roman population its lives, which was around 60 to 70 million, expanding from Spain and Greece to Egypt and North Africa. Verus succumbed to the illness in 169 CE and Aurelius too died from the same illness 11 years later. The impact of the Antonine Plague was devastating and catastrophic. It decimated the army, perished whole villages and towns, shrank the labor and hence weakened the trade and destroyed the economy. In general, a sheer sense of vulnerability and panic pervaded the outlook and the mindset of masses in the Roman Empire. Number 2. Plague of Justinian. Imagine you're an emperor dreaming of expanding your empire to the Mediterranean and Europe, laying the groundwork of a dynasty, but your dreams being shattered by some rats traveling on carts and ships sent to your capital as a tribute. For Emperor Justinian, this nightmare was a reality. It originated in China and was carried to Constantinople via sea trade routes. Its location along 2 seas made it the perfect crossroads for trade routes and plague. Beginning in about 541 CE, it made its way through Europe, killing as much as 10% of the world's population. Historians estimate 5,000 deaths each day at the peak of the disease in Constantinople. By the time it had alleviated in 590 AD, it had killed around 100 million people, including half the residents in Europe. It was so widespread that dead bodies littered the streets. Troops were called in to aid the disposal of the dead. After the graveyards were filled, trenches were dug, and bodies were dumped in the sea and buildings. This plague was credited with bringing the trade to a halt, destroying the Byzantine Empire and perhaps bringing on the Dark Ages. The outbreak continued for another 225 years before finally disappearing in 750 CE. Number 1. The Black Death. It entered Europe through Sicily, and eventually made its way to Italy's mainland. Thus, when 1349 CE ended, the disease had been widespread to France, Germany, Britain and Russia through the trade routes. Florence buried 50,000 of its residents. Paris lost 800 people on average each day at its peak. 1/3 of the Chinese population evaporated before anyone could understand what was coming. By the time the devastation of the plague settled, nearly half the population of Europe had surrendered to a painful death. Black Death was a great human tragedy, critical for the history of the world, and that is why it still is unparalleled in terms of its impact and intensity. It killed the young and the old alike, not discriminating between the rich and the poor. It perished entire monasteries, made Europe lose most of its doctors, and abandoned whole villages. It didn't spare even the outposts of Iceland. There were so many deaths that authorities were clueless about what to do with them. Even though plague may not seem as a relevant health issue in today's world, but it still is a threat and we must react to any minute outbreak seriously, educate the masses of its impact and help fight against it.